Welcome. If you're watching this video today, we are talking about grief and children. And I have Beverly Ritz with me today. Beverly is a dear friend of mine. We actually worked together on staff at a church for a number of years. I served as the minister to young families there, and she was the children's minister. Beverly, how long were you in children's ministry?
Just a little over 25 years.
25 years. Wow.
Yeah.
Lots of experience with kids and with families. And we're here today specifically to talk about children and grief and loss. Tell me a little bit about how you first got involved in working with kids dealing with grief.
There was a family at our church who the children had lost both parents through a domestic violence situation.
Mm.
And the grandparents, they had them there. And this was not too long after their deaths that this little girl I didn't really know these children all that well. They were fairly new to our church, and so I hadn't had time to make any kind of relationship with them. And I'm walking in the foyer, and this little girl stops me and she holds up her hand and says, "Look, this is my mommy's ring." And I sat down beside her and looked at the ring and said how pretty it was. And then I didn't know what to say to her after that or how to help her.
Mm.
So I decided that I needed some education on how to help kids who were hurting. And I sought that out and found that and started on my journey with helping kids in grief situations.
So, were there a lot of resources available dealing with that topic?
This is the God part of the story that I so just believe God did this. It was just like a week after this happened that our church got a letter in the mail about a program starting for kids in grief. And it was being offered by Christian Works for Children, which is an organization in Dallas that they have grief works, they have kid works, they have adoption works, they have mom to mom, all these different works that they have and ways that they help people. They have counseling works. And so they were looking for volunteers to come and facilitate their kids' grief group. So there was an extensive training, I don't know, probably over 40 hours of training. It was spread out over several weeks. And they brought in all these grief experts, and you had to pay to get the training. And so I wanted it so badly. I did that. And then there were like 40 people in that training, and they picked 12. And I was one of the 12 that they picked. That started me on that journey and gave me a wealth of information about kids and grief. Yeah. And I did that. I volunteered with them for 10 years in GriefWorks, and they were looking then for somebody to do their Kids in Divorce program, which is called KidWorks. And of course, kids in divorce have losses and grief as well. So I actually started that program for them, did that for them for 6 years on a part-time basis, doing my children's ministry at the same time. And then I had to resign and take care of parents who were aging. And so I did that. Yeah.
And I'm sure there was a lot of things from grief works for kids that carried over into the divorce side because, like you said, kids who are going through divorce are grieving similarly, not exactly the same, but similarly to those who've lost someone to death.
Yeah. They're grieving the death of their parents' marriage and their family structure as they knew it. So they have some pretty big losses as well and a lot of grief going on.
From your experience, what's different about grief in children compared to grief in adults?
Kids are going to ask questions and they're not going to understand everything. They're not going to understand that death is final or even what death is.
Mm.
And adults, on the other hand, have to do a lot of adulting when grief happens or when a death happens. And they can't always take the time to grieve or even be there for their kids when they need to be. But kids are so honest and open and real that you will often see the grief in them more, I think.
It's that old show, kids say the darndest things. There are a lot of things when we're grieving as adults that we don't say because we have filters, and kids don't always have those same filters. So they probably ask questions that would be very off-putting if it was from an adult, but it's just honesty coming from a child.
Yeah, exactly.
So, what are some of the most common ways that you see grief show up in kids? What do you look for? What do you see in kids that are grieving?
Younger kids, first of all, let me say this. If a child is old enough to love, they are old enough to grieve. And so you might think that toddlers are not there, but they're old enough to love and they're going to miss that person. And maybe they have been potty trained, or maybe they used to suck their thumb and they don't do that. Well, they may regress backwards. Even a preschool kid might do that. So you might have a regression there in those actions.
All right. So regression to previous developmental stages. What about kids that are like a little bit older, maybe elementary, or I guess how old did the kids that you worked with, how old were they?
I worked with the 9 to 12 year olds.
Okay.
And those age kids, you see the anger issue really coming out a whole lot more, I think, in them. So teenagers might be, they often don't want you to know that they're grieving and they might try and hide it. But younger than that, they're just more open with their grief. You may see kids start having problems at school, getting in trouble a lot, inability to focus, and maybe they eat less, or maybe they eat more. Maybe they sleep less, or maybe they sleep more. You just might start noticing different behavioral kinds of things with them. And if it's a parent that has died, often kids are going to they're going to worry about the other parent. Is the other parent going to die? And then what's going to happen to me? So they have lots of different fears and worries and confusion and things like that going on.
Absolutely. Just a lot of unknown and uncertainty going on in their lives at that point. And I would assume that older kids, like teenagers, they can turn to their peer group for emotional support, whereas that 9 to 12-year-old range doesn't really have the emotional ability to communicate that or to understand what they're feeling. And I could see why that would be expressed a lot in anger. Anger at the
Yeah.
world, anger at God sometimes, anger at the parent who left or the parent who is left. It's just probably going to come out lashing out at the world.
Yeah. And for some reason, to me, I think that 9 to 12 year old age group has a harder time with the grief. At least it always seemed that way to me. But
Okay.
just my thought.
All right. So difficulty in school, difficulty in relationships in general. So what are some things that adults, specifically parents and caregivers, what do they misunderstand about children and grief? Because as adults, again, we have our own issues that we're dealing with, and we have our own maturity and ability to cope with some of these things like loss. But what do we not get about where our kids are at in these difficult times?
I think sometimes adults think kids are going to get over it, that they're not really affected by it too much, because you may see kids playing outside 1 minute and having a good time, and the next minute they're coming in and having a meltdown. And grief doesn't end. It never ends. And yeah, the adults might think kids are not affected by it, but they are affected by it.
Yeah. So what's going on with that kid where 1 minute they seem to be great and everything's wonderful, and the next they're just like overwhelmed and unable to function?
I think that's a confusion for them. And I also think feelings are just feelings, they're not right or wrong. And what kids in these situations often have a lot of mixed feelings. And so all those mixed feelings are surfacing. And children grieve through their play, and their play is their work. So when they're out playing, they've got to focus and they're doing a little bit of work there.
Yeah.
When they come in, that goes away.
Hmm.
So therefore, the thoughts may start coming in, and they're thinking about them more, and then they're upset. They're mourning.
Yeah. That's interesting. Grieve, children grieve through their play, and their play is their work. So What would you typically see kids doing when they're playing that would be symptoms of grief or would be expressions of grief?
I don't, maybe just depending on them creating scenarios while they're playing and something happens in that scenario that brings out that grief. Play is also, when I use the word play, things that kids do like art or music or listening to music or getting out and exercising, those are ways to help process grief
Hmm.
for them.
And their play could be playing with their friends in their room, playing family or mom and dad play, and then, oh, mommy goes away and doesn't get to come back. Or it could be being outside, running around and playing aggressively. Could be any number of things. Okay. So that you touched on something earlier. Adults have this misconception that kids are resilient. That's the big word that a lot of people use. And they'll bounce back from this. Yeah, they lost their dad or their mom or both their parents, like the little girl that you worked with. But she's a kid, she's tough, she'll bounce back. Like, how true is that? Or are we just wishfully thinking when we say things like that?
Yeah, I do believe that is wishfully thinking. Kids are no more resilient than you or me sometimes. They may go with the flow and do whatever they have to do, and that may be appearing to be resilient, but deep down, that hurt is there and that grief is there, and it's something they're having to cope with. And I don't, because kids are kids, adults often don't get where they are and how it is affecting them and what they are thinking and why they are acting certain ways.
So let's move into now what are some practical things for parents to do or caregivers to do? How should a parent talk to a child about death in age appropriate ways or about their specific loss in a way that would be helpful to them?
Honest, age appropriate is the way to go because children are concrete thinkers and death is to them, they don't understand what it is, especially if they're younger. And so I think you have to be careful with what you say and how you say it so that they do understand. And if you say something like they're sleeping, well, the kid's going to wonder when they're going to wake up.
Yeah.
If you say they've passed on, the kids are going to go, where are they? Where'd they go?
Yeah.
And so I think mistakes adults will make is not saying it like they need to say it because they're afraid that it's going to upset the kid more. You can deal better with what you know than what you don't know.
Yeah.
So that's a big thing for adults to remember there. And I think one of the best things they can do for their kids is listen to them and let them know they can feel whatever they're feeling. I think adults need to be able to be honest about how they're feeling also and not worry that it's going to upset the kids. It may upset the kids, but that may give you the opportunity to talk about it together and say, it's okay to be sad.
Hmm.
It's okay to feel this way. And I think that's one of the biggest things parents need to do is share that with their kids. Let them see the emotional roller coaster, and that's more healthier than suppressing it
Yeah.
and acting like it didn't happen.
So parents need to not avoid expressing their own emotions appropriately, age appropriately with kids, and specifically talking about their own feelings about loss.
Yeah,
If a child says, I miss grandma too.
yeah. And there are all kinds of things you can do together as a family to remember that loved one because the holidays are going to come and the
Yeah.
chair is going to be empty. And the little girl that had her mom's ring on, that was important to her. Somebody knew to give that to her as something to keep her close to her mom. And so they might need something that belong to the person that died. Yeah. And they might need to draw them a picture of some memory that something they did together. And that picture might need to go in the casket with them
Mm,
when they bury them. I don't,
okay.
there are just all kinds of different ways that parents can celebrate the person and remember the person. And that can be comforting. Yeah. Are you sad and you're going to miss them? Yes. But it's
Okay.
important to do.
Talk a little bit more about just the immediacy of loss, like with the first few days after the funeral, what kids are going through then. Because as parents, a lot of times we're in shock ourselves.
Mm.
Like, how do we try to be cognizant of our children at that time and help them? And what are some things that we could do? Like you mentioned, drawing the picture and putting that in the casket, or should kids go to funerals? Should kids go to gravesides? Talk a little bit about all that.
Okay. I think children need choices in those situations, especially right after it happens. Do they want to see the body if there's a body? If they're cremated, that's a whole nother different thing there. But do they want to go to the funeral? And that's going to have to it's going to have to be a call that adults are going to have to make depending on the child. Everybody's different. Everybody grieves differently. And maybe it's too much for one of their kids to go. I don't know. That's a hard, tough thing, especially for parents when all that happens. So I think you have to be really careful about forcing, and maybe that's when you need to sit down and listen to your child more and see what's really there. And the fact that they're going to see other people mourning and grieving is it's going to be hard. I was 12 years old when I had a uncle killed very tragically. And I did know this uncle, but I didn't have a close relationship with him. But I remember getting to the funeral and seeing all of these people major league upset, which really upset me.
Hmm.
And that's going to affect your kids.
Yeah.
But I think talking to them to explain you're going to see their body, but they're not alive, they're dead. This is how we bury them. Having those conversations are so important. And one of the things I noticed in with the kids that I worked with, if somebody was cremated, they had a harder time with the death, and especially if they weren't part of when the ashes were spread, or if they didn't spread the ashes or whatever, there was no finality for them as
Yeah.
much. And I noticed that.
You pointed out that kids need choices, and if you have more than one child, they may be in very different places. They may have had different relationships with the person they lost. Some might have been really close to Uncle Fred, and some didn't really connect
Yeah.
with him that well. And so
Yeah. And
some may want to
they may
go,
not
and some may not.
they may not have that feeling. They're like, I didn't know him. Am I going to miss him?
Yeah.
Yeah. I, I remember when I was in elementary school, the day John F. Kennedy was shot. This Marine came to our school. We were eating lunch and he said something to the principal. And the next thing I know, we're all outside right after lunch. And they come over the loudspeaker and they tell us that the president has been shot. And these kids all around me are just boohooing. And I'm like, I didn't know the president. I didn't know why they were sad.
Yeah. It affects people differently.
Yes, yes.
And that's an important thing to remember is secondhand trauma and secondhand grief can be pretty powerful. And so if you have a child that wasn't really close, but they go to the funeral and they experience that trauma from seeing other people grieve, that can be upsetting to them.
Yeah. And you mentioned the word trauma here. A grandparent passing away at an older age and being expected, the kids may be close to them, and that may be traumatic for them. But then in the situation with the little girl at my church, I don't know how much she knew about how her parents died, but that was extremely traumatic. And that's going to be a whole different ball game when you're bringing in the different kinds of trauma, really hard trauma.
All right. And along those lines, think about us as adults. Like we can watch a very emotional movie and be moved to tears.
Yeah.
And it's all fake. It's not real at all, but it has a very deep emotional impact. And so our kids can have some similar experiences interacting with other people at a funeral or even going to the viewing or just talking to people that may be coming over to their home about how much they loved their grandma or how much they cared for that person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So, how do you help a child who refuses to talk about the loss, who doesn't want to go there?
Oh, that's a hard question. And I've thought a lot about that. I was with a family one time who had this child's grandparent was dying, and we were at the hospital, and it just had happened. And the dad came to me and he said, "My son is not crying." And I said, "It's okay. He may not feel like crying." And my thought is, you don't want to force them into something, which is what I think this dad eventually did, because about I saw him go over to the kid in just a few minutes. The kid was boohooing, and maybe the dad was giving him permission, but
All right.
I think you're just going to have to go with your gut and what your gut feels and how to help your kid at that time in that
Mm.
place.
And that kind of fits in with one of the other questions I had was how do you know when it may be time for professional help? And that may be one of those instances where this kid has suffered a significant loss because of their relationship with the person that they lost, and they haven't expressed that grief in any way that you've seen. Over time, they may need to go see somebody who specializes in working with children who have experienced grief or loss.
Yeah, I think when you start seeing extreme behaviors,
Mhm.
maybe anger is always a thing, but anger to the point where we're getting in trouble at school, or you see a child who is not sleeping or not eating, it's all of a sudden become very aggressive, can't get along, can't get along with friends, can't get along with family. Obviously, they need some help. And yes, they need to get some professional help.
Yeah. And yeah, they can look like any of those things. Anytime kids are not themselves, whenever they're acting out in different ways. And as they get a little bit older, it may be drugs or alcohol that they get involved in as a means to escape reality, to avoid the pain or the hurt. A little bit younger, their addiction may be technology. Maybe they just get sucked into video games. I know kids do that a lot these days, but if they've experienced a loss like this and they just want to escape the real world and constantly be on their Xbox or their phone or whatever it is, that may be one of the ways that they're trying to avoid dealing with things.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've seen some of that firsthand. Yeah.
What about kids who blame themselves for the loss? Maybe they lost a sibling and maybe they weren't watching them and they were by the swimming pool, or maybe it wasn't their fault at all, but they still blame themselves. How do you handle a situation like that?
Yeah, that's pretty common. And the reality is they need to be reassured that it was not their fault. And yeah, you need to give extra hugs, give extra reassurance, and get them professional help. And every situation is different because grief is different for everybody.
Beverly, I want to be aware of your time, and I just want to thank you today for being able to share with us. And I'll definitely have you back for a second episode. There are a lot more questions that I have to ask that I wanted to find out more information on. So thank you very much for sharing with us today.
You're welcome. Enjoyed it.
All right, we'll see you next time.